I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. India's Congress leader, that is the opposition party, Rahul Gandhi, as well as 11 leaders of other opposition parties who landed today at Srinagar airport were sent back to Delhi. Now, this was after, actually, the fact that Gandhi had actually been invited properly to visit that region because the government officials have said that they are convinced that everything is fine in that region and that Gandhi could have seen that for himself. Nevertheless, he has been sent back. There are reports that media that tried to speak to him as he arrived at the airport were mistreated as well. What does this say about a secular democracy? What does this say about the role of the opposition in a country like India, especially at this sensitive time since the revocation of Article 370 and 35A for Kashmir? Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're joined now by Kavita Krishnan, who is the secretary of the All India Progressive Women's Association. She's also a member of the Politburo of the Communist Party of India and the editor of its monthly publication called Liberation. She's joining us now from Delhi. Kavita, we appreciate you taking your time out of a busy schedule to join us. What are your thoughts about Gandhi being sent back along with the other opposition leaders?
Yes, so basically, I think the thing to realize is that this underlines the fact that the whole of Kashmir today is a prison. And all Kashmir's opposition leaders are basically in jail. Thousands of ordinary Kashmiri youth are in illegal custody. And ordinary Kashmiri people do not have basic freedom of movement or communication or freedom of expression or protest. And in this situation, naturally, when any opposition leaders are trying to visit Kashmir, this is not the first time. Congress leader in the past, as well as left leaders in the past, have tried to visit Kashmir and have been prevented, have been sent back from the airport. And I myself had managed to go to Kashmir, but that was because I went unannounced, along with 3 other people. We went unannounced, and we did not tell anyone that we were coming, and that is why we could sort of slip through the cracks. But officially, basically, the whole of Kashmir is under a lockdown. It is there is an it is like a declaration of emergency there. And I think that it's basically a deeply undemocratic act, because decisions have been taken about that state without consulting the people of that state or without there being any elected leadership in that state.
Yeah.
And in a way that those decisions go against India's own constitution, India's own claims of federalism and democracy. Yes.
So Kavita, when you were on the ground, what did you see? Just tell us a bit of your experience while you were there.
Yes, our experience was that there was barbed wire on almost every street in Srinagar and in urban Kashmir. And there was a paramilitary, that is CRPF deployment all over Kashmir. So virtually in every locality, outside every home, there would be armed, people, armed paramilitary personnel with guns and or pellet guns. And there were, so we had to do much of our movement on foot. We walked in most places, inside Srinagar, and we had to walk, inside lanes and by lanes in order to try and speak to people. But people were terribly afraid as well as terribly angry. And the fear was such that they would not allow us to use names or take photographs or videos and, take any details that might identify them. And yet, the fear, the anger was tremendous, because people kept telling us that this is basically what has been done to Jammu and Kashmir would not have been done to any other state in the country. You could not have simply woken up one morning. The central government could not wake up one morning and simply do away with the status and autonomy of any other state. And so that, in a way, they felt that dissolved the relationship between Kashmir and India, and they were terribly upset about this. There are no means of peaceful protest available in Kashmir. You're not allowed to stand on the street and hold up a placard or raise a slogan or hold a seminar or hold a public meeting, anything of that kind. Small boys as young as 9 or 10 years old, 11 years old, are being picked up and held in illegal custody for days on end in both police stations as well as army camps, in order to terrorize their parents in order to control their parents, so that the parents, out of sheer fear, would not would not be able to express their protest.
Yeah.
So this is quite a bad situation over there. Yes.
Indeed. And, Kavita, we've had a challenge, getting through to journalists and others who want just verified information from their experiences either on the ground, such as yourself or others. And a lot of them have said, listen, we're just afraid to speak to anybody at this point in time about what we know. We're just trying to do our work in as, of course, balanced and verified a fashion. But even that is becoming tougher as the days go by. What do you make of that sort of blockade, even on just information, this complete communication blackout? Certainly, that's a scary thing, isn't it?
Yes, the blockade on information is quite deliberate because I think that, it's an open secret what is being done to Kashmir. But the government of India does not want people in the world as well as, other states in India to even know what is happening there or to hear any Kashmiri voice because that would interrupt and mess up their narrative. So their narrative is that Kashmiris are basically recalcitrant children who don't know what's good for them. And yet what has been done is going to bring them great benefits. And so everything is going to be well now, once and for all. The reality is extremely different. The reality is that far from integrating Kashmiris into India, this has actually pushed Kashmiris further away. It has alienated them further. It has sent them the message that they are not equal, certainly not equal, and in fact that they are treated like property rather than like people. Kashmiri women and girls were telling us that there is all this talk about liberating us and making us free from our patriarchies. But actually, the leaders of the ruling party in India are talking about us as though we are the spoils of war, because they are saying, oh, now our North Indian men can get fair Kashmiri brides and that kind of language, which is basically like conquerors talking about the spoils of war.
Indeed. And on that point you made there at the end, I wanted to land on that because, it's worrying, isn't it, this language that is being used about Kashmiri women. As you said, of course, it does seem like, a conqueror almost, and that sort of language that we may have seen at one point in time in history, but we don't see, at least in the contemporary world. How worrying is that, in your opinion? Are Kashmiri women really in danger at this point?
See, yes, Kashmiri women are of course in danger, and they have been in danger even before this. It has not been a safe situation for them. Any conflict situation is never safe for women. All right, women face the brunt of conflict wherever there is an armed conflict, and the presence of vast military and paramilitary presence in civilian neighborhoods is always quite dangerous for women, certainly. But I think the situation right now is also worse because you have a Hindu majoritarian government in the center that in India, which believes that India should be a Hindu nation in which Muslims should not have equal position. And so they are projecting what has been done in Kashmir as the conquest of Hindus over a Muslim territory, a Muslim majority principality, and over rebellious Muslims. And that is something they are trying to sell in, to all of us as Indians, by trying to get ordinary Indians to basically approve of this or clap along with it. There have been protests in India against this, but I think that the situation is still ill understood. And this is where the blockade on information comes in. Because if people in India were to hear the voices of ordinary Kashmiris, they might change their minds if they were able to see and hear ordinary human beings somewhere. So there is this great interest in blocking the voices of ordinary people. So this, which is why a small, video documentary that we made, basically recording only the voices of ordinary Kashmiri people, that went viral in India because, and it had a huge impact because people who heard that basically paused and started thinking about what it is that they were being asked to applaud right now, and they started having second thoughts about applauding the movement or the decisions of this government.
So I wonder then, with this communication blackout, obviously this can't go on forever. I mean, at some point in time, the Kashmiri people's voices will be heard in some fashion. I imagine, as you said, through your own measures or others. When that does occur, and if this suppression continues of their voices, I mean, I imagine the anger will only boil even further, right, until it erupts in some fashion.
Well, I'm actually extremely concerned about the outcome then, because right now what you have in Kashmir, there is no pretense of any civil authority or civil control, right? It is military and paramilitary controlled completely. There are young paramilitary, basically young men and women paramilitary personnel who have never been in this kind of a situation. They have never been deployed where there is this kind of enormous civilian population. They are deployed there. And they are being trained and encouraged to look at ordinary Kashmiri peoples as the enemy, as dangerous. And therefore, I fear, I've been reading about India's Jallianwala Bagh massacre and understanding how the British colonialists basically acted as they did, partly because they had been coached and trained to fear. They were continuously fearful of the repeat of an 1857 type uprising of people. And so every and any expression, however peaceful, of protest was met with such terrible repression. And I fear the same situation happening in Kashmir right now, where even the most peaceful kind of protest may meet with truly brutal suppression and that repression, and that may send the situation, may end up being a really terrible situation. In fact, yesterday we heard reports that there was supposed to be a large protest march that was to go to the UN Human Rights Office in Srinagar. Yeah. The deafening silence from Srinagar, where we do not know what happened. Did that march take place? How was it? What was the outcome? Was there any kind of repression? What happened? We don't know anything. And the silence from there is so deafening that, in fact, a lot of us are extremely concerned and worried.
Kavita, just before letting you go, I wanted to come back full circle and come back to this issue of Gandhi and other political leaders being sent back, opposition political leaders, I should say. What does that say? Because, India's government keeps saying that everything is fine on the ground, actually. But then as one of the opposition leaders, I forget his name just right now, has said, listen, if everything is fine, then why are even leaders within the region actually under house arrest, etc.? What do you say to that?
No, I think there is no doubt that it's an open secret that nothing is fine. I don't think anyone really believes that anything is fine right now in Kashmir, because clearly the entire situation is abnormal, and you would not be holding people imprisoned and blockading information if things were fine. But I think the real issue is that the lack of empathy that they want to seed in us, the lack of empathy towards Kashmiri people and their suffering is what the Indian government is hoping for today. And that's what we are trying to basically interrupt. Because I think that you just mentioned Gandhi, and I think that on Kashmir, of course, there have been a variety of opinions by so many political leaders. But political leaders in India across the board, not just Nehru, but Sardar Patel, Gandhi, Jayaprakash Narayan, Ambedkar, all of them, if you look at the one thing that actually is a common thread in their respective positions on the Kashmir dispute, was that each of them felt that Kashmiri people were key to the solution, that we needed to listen with empathy to Kashmiri people, and that Kashmiri people should never feel that decisions are being made without taking them into account and without taking their voice and their opinions into account. And I think that what is really truly what should alarm us in India today and in South Asia more generally is that what is happening in Kashmir today is likely to be repeated in other parts of South Asia and India certainly, where this government is likely to basically impose this kind of emergency situation under one pretext or the other, get rid of various constitutional provisions in India, just as they have done in Kashmir. To give you just one example, the BJP government keeps referring to Article 370 as a temporary provision. Now, the same party and its organization RSS keeps referring to reservations for oppressed castes and indigenous communities in India also as a temporary provision. And their leader, the RSS leader, has just called for a debate on those reservations. And so it is very likely that not too long into the future, this government is planning to get rid of those as well. So I feel that we in India, we are struggling with basically trying to recognize that we need to stand up for Kashmiris now, because that basically means standing up for our own rights as well.
Indeed, a worrying precedent. We'll leave it there at that as our final comment, Kavita, but I sincerely appreciate your taking your time to speak to us here in the scope and putting that into context for us, of course. Viewers, as Kavita there said, and of course she's seen this firsthand, the barbed wires, etc., the communication blackout she has experienced that as well there while being on the ground in Kashmir. And for the few people that have been able to have their voices come out, it's all just been worrying, really. And now with Rahul Gandhi and other opposition leaders being blocked from even entering the region, even though, interestingly, the governor himself was the one who actually invited Rahul Gandhi to visit to prove to him that everything was fine. Certainly everything is not fine if the opposition leader needed to be blocked then from entering that region, as well as media and others, of course, that have been blocked as well from doing their work, verifying information that the government claims is true. We'll keep a very close eye on that here in Scope, though. I'll be back, though, with our next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. We're going to discuss now the G7 summit, which will be beginning today in Biarritz in France. France, of course, hosting it this year. Obviously, this year, the G7 countries seem even more divided than they were last time around when they all gathered in Canada. And there's a lot of issues individually in each of the G7 countries. And then, of course, as a group as well, we can talk about the trade war, which is, of course, a global issue, not just for the G7. But then there is Boris Johnson coming in this year, Brexit looming large, Donald Trump, the tariffs back and forth between China and the U.S. and just Donald Trump coming in essentially in just a bad mood because there are concerns also about the U.S. economy. There's a lot going on. And then on top of all of this, there is Macron, who wants this all to be about inequality and fighting inequality. But yet Oxfam released a report in the lead up to this G7 summit saying, in fact, these G7 countries further inequality globally. So let's discuss all of that a bit further and speak with our esteemed guests. We're joined now by Ken Fraser, who is a lecturer in international relations at the School of Government and International Relations at the University of Sydney. He's joining us now from Sydney itself. And we're also joined by Michael Lane, who is the founder of the American Institute for Foreign Policy. He's joining us now from North Carolina. Michael and Ken, thank you both for your time. Ken, I'd like to ask a question to you, actually, because this year, obviously, Scott Morrison as well is in attendance at this G7 summit. What do you think Scott Morrison will be seeking to achieve, and what will Australia bring to the table on the many global issues of importance to the G7, be it inequality, be it climate change, etc.?
Well, Scott Morrison is a brand new Prime Minister for Australia, so he's a bit of an unknown quantity for us. It's be good to bear in mind that it was an Australian Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, who had the idea of expanding the G7 into the G20, which seems like a somewhat less of a rich man's club. So it's a bit hard to say what Scott Morrison will be taking there in terms of specifics. I think he's so new in the job now, he's only been in it for a few weeks, that he's more than likely to be just making friends and introducing himself around, I suppose. But of course, Australia actually has quite a relatively substantial economic base comparatively to the rest of the world, and so we have plenty to say. And so Scott Morrison could probably be relied on to be a pro-business kind of a person. I think that's his general outlook on life, is that to get rich is glorious, and so he would be looking to pursue those sorts of policies, I should imagine.
All right,
promote that kind of thinking.
Right. Okay, so Michael, there you heard that the Australian leader would be coming in, obviously, from a pro-business standpoint, and that becomes that much tougher, doesn't it, in a world where seemingly globalization is falling apart, it seems, and a lot of people, again, Michael, would blame Donald Trump for that?
Well, I certainly think that President Trump has tried to change the way world business is done. One would argue he has had some successes and is still, for the vast majority of it, a work in progress. The whole purpose of the G7 or the G8 in its former years was the larger economies of the world getting together, trying to figure out how they can keep the world economy on track, avoid the lows, the recession, see if there's coordinated effort that can make this work better for everyone. That's not President Trump's style. President Trump's style is, quote, America first, unquote. And so he's not likely to sign off on policies that will restrict his ability to grow the American economy if it's good for the rest of the world. He wants the United States to be out there, the leader. And one of the things he's quite concerned about in this meeting, which is why maybe some people would wonder, is it worthwhile this year, is Europe's economy is essentially flat. They are teetering on the verge of recession. They may even, indeed, a couple of their economies be in recession at this particular point in time. And President Trump still believes in the American economy. We are still growing, not as fast as we were a year ago. But the president does not want to limit his own ability to deal with the U.S. economy. That's why we have the potential conflict that's coming, I think, and we'll see how that's resolved.
Okay, so give us your point of view on that, Ken, because certainly, even as Trump has said, he's not the president of the world, he's the president of the United States, and he would obviously need to put his country's interests first. But again, this has ramifications for all of us around the world, and certainly where you're sitting in Australia too. How then does the world come to terms with this new way that the U.S. is acting when it comes to the global economy or even other issues?
Well, it's interesting that you should bring up other issues, and the mention of the G8 is apposite here because, of course, Russia was thrown out of what was then the G8 because of their invasion of Ukraine. And so Donald Trump's now saying, oh, well, maybe we should let them back into the tent again. It's been long enough, they've been punished enough and we should bring them back in. So that has very powerful strategic implications if the Russians and others see that the US is not willing to stand firm and to lead the rest of the world in very strong and prolonged responses to that kind of behaviour. That's clearly going to encourage Putin himself and also other.
But then Ken, if I may come in, Donald Trump's reasoning is he's not necessarily siding with Russia, from what I've understood at least, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. He's just saying Russia needs to also be at the table, the negotiating table, that is. So if it is to be held to account for its actions, it can be done so, in a more direct fashion.
Sure, well, I think that's a reasonable point. I mean, it's always better. I think it was Winston Churchill who said it's better to jaw than to war. So obviously, it's better to be talking about it than shooting at each other about it. So it would just be a symbolic thing. I don't think it's a very big issue because it has been a while since those events, and while no doubt the people of Ukraine remember them and will. This ongoing unrest there. The rest of the world forgets about these things awful quickly. So we move on to other things, other topics like inequality and the environment. Leaving that issue is left behind now, which is basically what Putin was counting on from the beginning. I think that if he just stayed there for long enough, everybody would forget about it and move on to other issues.
Yeah, Michael, it seems that, like Macron wanted this year's summit to go smoothly. You see, just in the lead up to the summit, we've had this back and forth on our tariffs, China placing those tariffs on, I believe, $75 billion, if I'm not mistaken, of U.S. goods, and then Trump responding essentially in kind as well. That seems to sour this sort of summit again, doesn't it? Will this be a repeat of what happened in Canada last year? Will this all essentially just go south and prove again to the rest of the world how divided this G7 group really is?
Well, I think President Macron's primary objective in this is not any of the discussions, but to avoid a circumstance where it looks like everybody goes home dissatisfied, in a foul mood. He'd like to project as the host country, President Macron would like to project some sort of image of unity and success, even if there will be no final communique that will be issued and signed by all the countries together. That may not be possible. It remains to be seen how this is going to come out. There are a few topics on the agenda that President Trump should be standing alone on. I think particularly the discussions on the environment. He's already signaled that he's not going to attend it personally. He's going to leave his Environmental Protection Administration administrator to attend that his place.
Yeah.
So we'll see. Again, there are areas I think where you brought up China and what's going on with the global trade situation with China. I think most of the world hopes that Donald Trump is successful in his dealings with China and gets China to cease and desist on some of the trade practices that they've been pursuing over the last 20 years. On the other hand, they are not willing to risk a worldwide recession to get there. And apparently President Trump is willing to risk that. So we'll see how that comes out.
And do you think, Michael, that he'll essentially partner with Boris Johnson? Because that's been spoken about a lot, hasn't it? Where Boris Johnson may very well come into the summit as somebody who wants to get that much closer now to Donald Trump, because he obviously has something to prove himself going into a possible no-deal Brexit, and he badly needs a trade deal with the U.S.
Yeah, I think that's one of the actually accurate, truthful storylines of this G7 summit. And watch the Johnson-Trump relationship very closely. By process, of course, they can't come to any agreements until after Brexit is accomplished, either through a negotiated exit or through a just cold exit on the whole thing. But yes, the United States and Great Britain will have a very, very close, warm relationship, I believe, to the benefit of both countries. President Macron, of course, has been busy tweeting that Trump will take advantage of the UK's weakened situation when they go through Brexit. I think that the historical nature of our two countries is going to be such that President Trump will probably give Boris Johnson a better trade deal down the road than anybody else would have been able to get. But again, that's down the road. We're not looking at that next month or even before the end of the year, I don't think.
All right. Well, I'm going to say thank you there to Ken and Michael for their time. Ken was speaking to us there from Sydney, and Michael was joining us there from North Carolina. We appreciate, of course, them taking their time out to share their thoughts with us about the G7 summit, which is currently underway. We'll keep a very close eye on that, though, and I'll continue that topic after the short break. Stay with us. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. We're going to continue to discuss the G7 summit that will be underway soon there in Biarritz in France. Joining us to discuss that further now is Diane Francis, who is an author. She's also a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and is editor-at-large at the National Post. She's joining us now on the line from Toronto. We're also joined by Florian Peschl, who is an independent political researcher. He's also a regular contributor to Forbes, and he's joining us now from Vienna in Austria. Florian and Diane, thank you for your time today. Diane, I'd like to start with you. Obviously, Trudeau last year, Prime Minister Trudeau, I should say, Diane, was embarrassed, obviously, because of the whole communique issue, as you well know. At the end, Donald Trump refusing to sign it, or actually rescinding his signature, on that communique. This year, Macron just choosing not to have a communique altogether. A lot of people then questioning, Diane, what is the point of this G7 summit if these countries are so divided?
Well, I think the point is that divided, they have to discuss their divisions and try and resolve the differences. I think it's always valuable to have a summit like this. I think the summary statement was always kind of a concoction of generalizations that they were pretty much a prescription and they were followed, but it wasn't necessary and it wasn't the point of the whole summit. So I think that good work will be accomplished. There seems to have been a lot of bilateral discussions between countries in the lead up to it. So a lot of it bilaterally will have been sorted, hopefully. But I think it's always important to have a summit.
Okay, Florian, what are your thoughts about that? Because, even Donald Trump, Florian, it's been reported, has cast the whole point of this, again, considering, I believe, the divisions and otherwise.
Well, I think it's not surprising that Donald Trump criticizes or questions the point of multilateral meetings. He's more a person for bilateral talks. That's the way he communicates with other state leaders. But I also think it's very important to still, even if we cannot expect much content-wise, policy-wise, it's still important that we have these kind of summits. It's about representing a certain kind of cooperation, and showing it to the world. So I think from symbolically and diplomatically, it's still very important to hold these meetings.
Okay, let's add another voice to this conversation. We're also joined now from Paris by Emmanuel, who is the president of the Institute for European Perspective and Security, the IPSC. Emmanuel, thank you for your time today. Emmanuel, do you think Macron will be successful in holding a smooth summit, as he's probably praying for, or do you think that the divisions will be very clear for everyone to see, be it over trade, be it over climate change, even, and obviously the Amazon forest currently under a lot of concern right now worldwide?
Well, I think I hope I heard correctly your question.
Yes.
The summit is of no interest at all, as the environment in which the summit is taking place and the invitees who will be coming. By the way, it is not only 7 countries, but 22 delegations who are going to come, as France has invited a certain number of partners. Each have their own agenda. And as the summit will be starting only by tomorrow, we'll have only one day of discussion. And of course, the number of issues are absolutely not consensus. The question about the opposition concerning Jair Bolsonaro policy in regards to the Amazon forest has not total sustain of the participants of the G7. I'm quite sure that Donald Trump, who is praising the sustain of Brazil to get out of the Paris Agreement of December 2015, will of course sustain his partner on that subject. Emmanuel Macron is delivering a speech now, saying that there are a certain number of subjects on the table, amongst which the potential non-signature of the EU-Mercosur agreement, which, of course, is not sustained by Germany. Germany has said it is not the answer, that is not the correct answer. And, of course, we must have in mind that a certain number of members of the G7 have their own difficulties, their own internal difficulty. Boris Johnson, who has met Emmanuel Macron a few days ago in Élysée, has made quite clear that he will be strongly supporting his policy and its position concerning the Brexit. Angela Merkel is weakened politically, and of course Giuseppe Conte is no longer Prime Minister or President of the Council. So,
so Emmanuel, let me just come in here, because they're not the only leaders weak, all right? It's not just European leaders. In fact, Diane, we know that Trudeau is actually currently under shadow because of a scandal that's taking place in Canada itself. In fact, the SNC-Lavalin scandal. I wonder if it is, as you had pointed out, Diane, earlier on, still worth it to have such a summit, even if there is so much disagreement between this group of nations. Why not then have Russia come back in and make this the G8 again, as Donald Trump is advocating for?
Oh, well, the Russian thing would be absolutely beyond the pale. I mean, that's ridiculous. This is a country that has broken all international treaties and norms. It's a pariah nation run by a very evil dictator who has invaded a European country. I mean, he's taken 7% of the Ukraine, and, he hasn't answered for it. There's a war going on. 13,000 people have died. The untold amount of billions of dollars of damages. His soldiers shot down a commercial jetliner that departed from Amsterdam Airport. I mean, and he's also, probably very responsible for propping up the Syrian regime and perpetuating a war there that has, cast out 5 or 6 million people from Syria and destroyed the country. I mean, to have a man that awful inside the G8 when he was kicked out for doing those things would be a complete abrogation of the G7 in my mind, completely. And it's just not possible. The Russia should also be removed from the Security Council of the United Nations.
But then, is it a healthy way, Diane? And I'm not taking a step. I'm just saying that is it a healthy way to go about dealing with a country like Russia to just keep it, outside of any negotiations or discussions? I mean, wouldn't it be healthier to have Russia at the negotiating table, as Donald Trump has advocated for, and have it directly answer then questions from all of the above countries?
It was called the Minsk Agreement, which they have not abided by, but that is joined by France, Germany, Ukraine, and Russia. That's the negotiating table, and that's where he should be, and that's where they should be working out what to do about his withdrawal from Ukraine and paying for the reparations that he should pay for the damage he's caused to that country. That's the forum. To let him back into the G8 gives him a prestige and also reneges all of the punishment that was given by the G7 when they kicked him out in the first place. He's not made right any of the reasons that he was kicked out for, and then some.
Okay. Florian, what are your thoughts on that? What are your thoughts about Russia being brought back into the forum?
It's a difficult question. I also I agree with Diane that they shouldn't be brought back now. Like as long as there are no commitments to solving the Ukraine crisis, as long as Russia doesn't even admit certain things that it is doing in Ukraine, as long as that's not happening, I don't see a chance for Russia to come back into the G8.
But then, Emmanuel, we have Donald Trump again, as Donald Trump does. He's again on the opposite polar side of what many of these leaders want, be it according to Russia, what it wants with Russia or otherwise. Do you think he'll get his way, or do you think that he'll remain very much on the outside when it comes to this issue over Russia?
Well, of course, we have to take in consideration that both Boris Johnson, Angela Merkel, and Justin Trudeau have said there is no way that Russia will be invited into G8. As you know, G7 and this type of forum needs consensus. So the question is not to be raised, and I think it will be not raised or not solutioned in the G7 summit of Biarritz. And by the way, Russia has made very clear by the voice of Sergei Lavrov that it does not want to come back to G8 for a practical and a geopolitical reason. Taking in consideration that the old world, which represented 2/3 of the growth when it was launched in 1975 by France, is no longer accurate to speak to the rest of the world. The G7 countries represent not more than 45% of the global the wealth of this of the planet. So Sergei Lavrov has said that it would emphasize its position in type G20. It would push its partnering countries to fulfill their commitment to enter G30, and it will, of course, sustain and develop its position and its diplomatic initiative throughout the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which will be meeting next month at the same tonality as the previous G7 was held. Remember when it was held in Quebec, in Canada, in May 2017. There was no consensus between the 7 countries. A month later, the 8 countries belonging to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization gave another picture and another perspective on the orientalization of the international relations. So I'm not sure Russia has the will to come back to G7. Vladimir Putin has made very clear when he met Emmanuel Macron that he was waiting for the Ukrainians to propose an initiative. And of course, President Zelensky has made quite clear that now he was willing to have new negotiation with both Russia and the European Union. And I think this is one of the results, not of the G7, but of the bilateral relations which have initiated.
All right. So if you allow me, Emmanuel, I wanted to move on to something else, Diane, and I want to ask you, last year when the summit occurred in Quebec, and, there was talk about, and I've heard it put this way, and you can correct me if you think it's incorrect, but 6+1 in the sense that Donald Trump was the odd one out. But this year it seems, now with Boris Johnson as Prime Minister of the UK, that it may very well be 5+2, where Boris Johnson wants to appease Donald Trump as much as he can ahead of Brexit. Do you think that that is the trend now, Diane, that we are moving to at least a G7 G7 group of countries where each country is, I don't know if this is the right word, but more right-wing or more to the right in its policies, be it economic, be it towards climate change or otherwise?
Well, I think we have what we have going on is a bit of a breakdown in the international consensus gathering system, and that is that the Americans have been growingly ambivalent about the United Nations, and Donald Trump's protectionism and nationalism, shall we say, is also affected his relationship within the G7. And even to a certain extent within the larger organization, the G20 or 22. He's not a consensus guy. He likes to do bilateral things because he has leverage over anybody he does a bilateral with, including China. And so that's his way of doing things. But, he is a very difficult character, even within the U.S. context. And you can see that he contradicts himself in policies. 1 minute it's this and 1 minute it's that. I think that was what the casualty was of the last G7. He probably said one thing, it went down in the communique as another thing, and then he had a temper tantrum. He's a very difficult character. Boris Johnson is also seemingly kind of a prickly, difficult character. And of course, he's trying to, engineer a friendly divorce with the European Union, which I don't think is possible. So, yes, it could be 5-2, but I think there are enough issues that they should get their minds around beyond their own little bubble political ideas to come to some consensus, whether it's Brazil and the environmental things and some other things. I think it's very important.
Very well. We're going to have to leave there as our final word, but of course we appreciate all of our guests for them. That was Diane, who was speaking to us from Toronto. We were also joined by Emmanuel, who was speaking to us from the French capital, and Florian, who was speaking to us from Vienna. We, of course, appreciate all of their insight. Now, viewers, as all of our guests throughout this segment on G7 have spoken about, these are divided countries, certainly. No one can deny that. There will be no final communique, as Emmanuel Macron, the French president, has already declared, not wanting, of course, a repeat of what occurred last year. However, there are issues which these countries may agree on. The Russia being brought back into the fore, seemingly, according to all of our guests at least, will not be occurring or will not be decided upon, at least in this specific summit there in France. We don't know what the future holds, of course, on that issue vis-a-vis Ukraine or otherwise. But then there are other major issues, climate change, Australia's Prime Minister in attendance, and of course, we weren't able to discuss this, but the Indian Prime Minister also in attendance. And, we're going to be looking very closely here at Indus News about any talk that comes out between Prime Minister Modi and possibly President Trump or other bilateral meetings that he may have about what's occurring there in occupied Kashmir as well. That, of course, also an extremely important international global issue as well. We'll keep a close eye, as I said, on the G7 summit and what occurs there here at Scope as well. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.